Hi, everyone. I am Rabbi Boxman. I'm excited to see everybody back here. We are back with popular demand. Rabbi Moeller will be leading us in additional discussions about the Stars of David. It was such a hit the first round that we were asked many times to another session. Actually, another 4 sessions. So you are in for a treat. If you liked the first round, you're going to like this round even better. So I am going to remind you of a few things since we haven't been together for a few weeks. If you would like to raise your hand, the best way to do that is actually virtually. In the corner of your screen, you should have 3 little dots, which will give you an option to raise your hand. Once you have that, it will come up on the side of the screen, and our hosts, Robin and Susan, will be able to see in which order hands were raised and who has a question. You may also, if you figure that out, you may also simply physically raise your hand. It just means they may not, we have multiple screens of people, so they may not actually see you right away. So if you can figure out how to do it virtually, that is ideal. You may also type a question in the chat. So there is a chat room that, or you can send privately to Susan or Robin, and they will make sure that your questions get asked at the appropriate times. At this time, I'm going to mute everybody. But if you would like to speak, you're going to have to unmute yourself. In the same way, if you scroll over your box where your picture is, you should see something that says mute or unmute. Also, at the very bottom of your screen, you should have a microphone that you can click or unclick in order to unmute. With that, Susan and Robin, did I forget anything?
No, I think we're good.
All right, so I'm going to turn over to Rabbi Moeller, and you can get comfortable, sit back, and enjoy the session.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi Boxman. Well, it's wonderful to see everyone again. I hope you've all remained safe and sane with this ongoing pandemic.
Oh, sorry, I muted Rabbi Moeller by accident, sorry. Rabbi, if you can unmute.
There we go. All right. Did anyone hear what I said previously?
Yes, I heard you.
Oh, you did? Okay. Well, some are shaking their heads. Anyway, welcome back. I've missed you the last month. It's great to be back. I hope you've all remained safe and have stayed sane in this continuing pandemic, but it's wonderful to be able to take a break and spend a little time learning about some favorite people that we've enjoyed over the years in American politics and entertainment, and I think we're really going to have a lot of fun. So if we could just start, I want to review the Jewish identity spectrum and the 10 different categories, and I'm going to go into a little bit more detail than we did the last time. Consider this Jewish Identity 201. For those of you who may be joining us for the first time, don't worry, you won't get lost. It'll still be understandable. But I just wanted to delve a little bit into the 10 different categories. There are different ways that Jewish people consider their own connection to Judaism. Some Jews are religious and have a strong belief in God. That's the first section you see there at the top. And that would include Shabbat observance, high holiday attendance, performing mitzvot in the Torah, going to temple. If you like to study theology, or you're into theodicy, which is why do bad things happen, and especially if you find yourself engaged in spiritual endeavors, that would put you in the religion God category. Culture, ethnicity has to do with things like the Hebrew language, observing Jewish holidays, performing rituals, eating Jewish foods, dress, dance, even things like physical features or Jewish humor, if you like to tell jokes, that all goes in the culture ethnicity rubric. Israel Zionism, pretty obvious connection to the Jewish homeland, looking at Israel as a refuge, as a safe haven, the law of return, which allows any Jew in the world to seek a place of residence in the state of Israel. Association and community. This is in terms of someone could be not religious at all or have any connection to Israel, but still feel like they have some sort of simpatico with other Jewish people. That would include things like, do you feel it's important to marry a Jewish person? Do you feel it's important to raise your children in the Jewish religion? Do you like to hang out with Jewish friends? Are you involved in the Jewish community? Do you take pride in our people's achievements when you see someone on TV and you say, oh my gosh, they're Jewish, and you feel that little tingle of pride? There's a Jewish way of thinking. Words like sechel, Jewish ingenuity or common sense, having rachmanis, that extra compassion that we Jews have for when we see misfortune or suffering, and what we call a gute neshama, a good soul. So those are things that have to do with association. Anti-Semitism, otherness, I think is pretty obvious, but we think of all the discrimination, prejudice, hatred against Jews through the centuries, things like quotas in this country, all the way to genocide in the Holocaust. History survival. We find some people who just are simply enamored by the span of the millennia of Jewish history, going 4,000 years, and we have survived. So for some people, their identity is expressed in the pride of Jewish survival. Tradition, heritage. This is about generations who've influenced us. Do you do things because your parents did? Do you like to follow certain rituals because your grandparents handed those down to you? We call that ledor vador, from generation to generation. Social justice, tikkun olam. Some Jewish people exercise their Jewish identity solely in terms of tikkun olam, making the world a better place, getting involved in things like racial discrimination or sexual discrimination, or any area in which you feel there needs to be healing and improvement. So that is considered to be social justice and tikkun olam. The giving of tzedakah would be in that category. Study and learning. Do you like to focus on the ideas of Judaism? Do you go to Torah study? Do you like to take classes and learn about Judaism? After all, we are the people of the book. This would also include our focus on education and achievement, that we strive on successful involvement through advancing ourselves intellectually. And finally, ethics, morals, and values. Some of us associate with Judaism specifically because we admire the values that we're taught in the Jewish texts, from the Bible all the way through commentaries, codes, and the Midrash. Any way we achieve and understand Jewish ideals, values, ethics, the idea that somehow we adhere to a different moral code, and the idea that you shall be holy from the book of Leviticus. So those are the 10 different categories. And what I'd like to do now is just flash the composite Jewish identity spectrum that we finished up with last week, or last month, after we studied our 4 personalities. And this is how it was divided up. 9% of the time, people associated with religion and God. Culture and ethnicity, you see, is a much bigger chunk, occupying 17% of our pie chart. Israel and Zionism, surprisingly, only 6%. Association, community, 12%. And the largest category, not surprising, is that most Jews feel a connection to their people and religion when there is anti-Semitism. That's 24%, almost a quarter. The other categories were small: history, survival, tradition, heritage, social justice, tikkun olam, only 8%. We'd like to see some of those categories achieve a higher ranking. Study and learning, 8%, ethics, morals, and values, 9%. So what do we learn from this? We learn that most Jews feel a connection through culture, ethnicity, association, community, and anti-Semitism and otherness. Let's see if some of these values will change as we study our next 12 people over the following 4 weeks, including today. And the first person will be Beverly Sills. Before we do that, though, are there any questions? You were all so polite and quiet, the first Stars of David, but I really want to encourage you to stop me, and if you have a question, if you'd like to make a comment, and particularly as we study these individuals, if you connect in any way yourself, please feel free. I want this to be more of a give and take. And when we study Mike Nichols for our third personality, I'm going to give you an example of how we can connect personally to some of these things. All right, so I'll stop for a second. Does anyone have anything they'd like to say so far? Any questions about the Jewish identity spectrum?
Michael Rubin has a question. Michael?
Were individuals to choose only one of these? Because it seems to me that most Jews would choose 2 or 3 or all 10 of these.
Yes, good question. All of these, as we studied each chapter, I took cues from what they said and divided up their Jewish identity amongst all 10. Any of the 10 were eligible. Most of the personalities were 3 or 4 categories that they picked. So I would say none of them had all 10, really. So yeah, most of them just had 3 or 4. And like I said, most of them had culture, ethnicity, association, and anti-Semitism, and the others were very sporadic. And that was a discovery in this book, is that most Jews really don't identify with study and learning or tikkun olam. And those are things that we really need to focus on in the 21st century because that's the essence of our faith. So right now we have a lot of our people, and it may have been just limited to Jews in the entertainment world or the political world. Maybe they felt pressure from general society to sublimate their Jewish identity. That's a question for Jewish sociologists to study, but that's what we discovered.
Yeah.
And Jane has a question.
Mm-hmm.
Jane, actually, kind of a comment from all the years of being an educator and working in Jewish education. Well, first of all, we're looking at celebrities here. These are people. I don't see that they picked a lot of Jewish scholars, for instance, because you would have gotten a skewed different thing. They didn't ask a lot of rabbi spouses. It's right. So we have to understand that. But one of the things that I always recognize, because these are people that were admired in some way or another, that anti-Semitism and otherness comes out so huge, was a disturbing part of trying to educate kids, in the years that I was educating kids. And I had some who just wanted, don't tell me about, don't just teach me about the Holocaust, which we have to know about, but the emphasis that comes out on that, instead of on, say, tikkun olam and social justice, or any of what we learn about taking care of the world. I think that we have to be mindful of that as grandparents, to make sure the message that we're getting across is how we feel positively about Judaism. And maybe these people, many of them didn't get that message because a lot of them didn't have educations. Anyway, that's my 2 cents about that.
And you've made 2 excellent points. The first being that this identity spectrum would be different depending on the groups of individuals that we're studying. If we're looking at professors at Hebrew Union College, it's going to be very different. If we're looking at members of a congregation, it might be a lot more skewed to religion and God. So you're absolutely right. There is something to be said for the sample of individuals that we're taking from this book, because they all are in some way, they've made it in American society, they're famous, and they have to be conscious of their, not just of their identity, but of their reputation amongst all of American society. That's number 1. Number 2, you're absolutely right, is that I personally find too much of a preponderance of identity focused on the Holocaust and anti-Semitism, and that cannot be a viable Judaism for the 21st century. These other categories of study and learning and tikkun olam and a connection to history, we want to see those numbers grow if we're going to do our job right and have Judaism saved for the next generation. So that's really important, and I'm glad you brought that up. Thanks, Jane. I see another hand.
Judith, you'll have to unmute. Or maybe we can unmute you.
Yeah, You have to. Okay. I just want to make a comment that I'm finding it among my friends and people I know. They vote politically based on one of the Jewish spectrum, which is anti-Semitism, and their political influence and their politically the way they see the world is through anti-Semitism, and that's how they vote in political elections.
Yes,
I'm finding that out.
right. You know, that's something, you know, we don't want to be considered a one issue community. And some Jews vote absolutely only in terms of, is it good for the Jews?
Exactly.
Is it good for the state of Israel?
Right.
And I think we need to be broader focused
I
than that.
know. And I feel very bad about it because that's happening an awful lot I see it with people I know. That one, you know, the anti-Semitism is, the one spectrum is the most important in every way.
And what else would we expect in the aftermath of Pittsburgh and San Diego?
Right.
That Israel continues to be beleaguered, the BDS, and all these other attacks. So yeah, it's almost natural that you're going to see an uptick in that connection to how Jews vote. The only way to stop that, let's cut out anti-Semitism and let's do everything we can to ensure that Israel has not just the right to exist, but is able to make peace with its Arab and Palestinian neighbors, and God willing in the future. But yes, we would like Jewish people to be able to vote according to their full conscience and not just look at things in terms of their Jewish interests. Thank you. Good point.
Arlene, I see your hand is up. Let's, if it's a short question, otherwise we can take it later. If you have to unmute yourself, and then this will be the last question, or we're not going to get to all three of our stars for today.
Just a quick comment. We're taking stars who are celebrities in the society and projecting them on an entire Jewish population. And those are two different things. The ADL has surveys on the same kind of thing, and that was the general population. I think we've gone beyond the book. Just
Thank you.
Yes, very important point to make. The opinions expressed herein are not necessarily representative of the entire American Jewish community. Absolutely. They speak for themselves and for themselves only. We're not attempting to make any broad generalizations that this is the way that all American Jews feel. Although I suspect that it would be very interesting to find out if we were to do this identity spectrum with a broader range of people. Maybe that's something for the future down the road. As a matter of fact, in October, we hope that we'll have an opportunity to let you make your own Jewish identity spectrums. So we're thinking about doing something like that. Anyway, let's get started with Beverly Sills, someone we all have known and loved. Sadly, she passed away at the age of 78 in New York City in 2007. She was born Belle Miriam Silverman in 1929, and she has been known as America's Queen of Opera. In 1980, she received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Carter, and she really has been known as the most famous soprano in the world. And we all know her and love her. My mother used to listen to her all the time, and there would be tears coming down her face when she would listen to her. She had such a beautiful voice. So she recalls, she talks about her grandparents. Her grandfather was actually a sort of a political refugee. He went from Russia to Paris to study engineering, and he was influenced by the founder of the American Socialist Party, Eugene Debs. So he was radicalized by him, and when he came home, he was disowned from the family, and so he abandoned his wife and 3 young daughters to go to New York City. And it was only through the help of Eugene Debs that eventually his family was able to reunite with him in America. And the youngest of those daughters was Beverly's mother. So she recalls memories from her Romanian grandmother. On her mother's side, she would make wonderful seders. She had 15 children, her grandmother. So I guess Beverly had lots of aunts and uncles, and her mother was the youngest of the 15, or her father was the youngest of the 15 children. And she remembers what a stalwart woman her grandmother was. If they had 60 people for Seder, she did all the cooking. And Beverly remembers the teglach and the knishes and chicken, and more chicken. She began her career at age 7, and her name was changed to Beverly Sills. It was renamed by her producer, Walter Wanger, who felt that having Belle Miriam Silverman on a marquee was not going to quite make it. So that's why she had her name changed. And by the way, she was known as Bubbles to her family because she had such a bubbly personality. And I read it on the internet that she was born with a bubble in her mouth. So that's why she was called that. Life was not all smiles and laughter for Beverly in real life. Her mother was a very strong woman, and Beverly described her as highly intelligent, charismatic, strong, stalwart, and magnificent in appearance. People would turn their heads when she'd be walking down the street. And she had dreams for her children. Unfortunately, one of those dreams was that they would marry a Jewish person. Well, Beverly met Peter Buckley Greenough, a man who was not Jewish, a man who was married and was 13 years older and was going through a very contentious divorce. So this did not sit well with Beverly's mother, and she was quite unhappy about that. And she said, she burst into tears and said, "Why does everything happen to my baby?" So it was not well received. Now, if she was the quintessential Jewish mother, she would have said, "Why does everything happen to me?" Just like Rebecca said in the book of Genesis, when she told Jacob, she told Isaac, "If Jacob marries a Hittite woman, what will my life be worth?" All right. So she was not happy about the wedding. She said, "My father was already dead. I think she was grateful that he was. And yet we both agreed that Peter was my father's kind of man." That was one aspect of the fact that her life was not a bed of roses. And she raised Peter's 3 children, one who was handicapped, and had 2 more with Peter, both who were born with disabilities. Her daughter Meredith was deaf, and her son Peter Jr. was autistic. And her religious faith did not help her get through these crises in any way. She relied on her mother, who she revered. So I'm going to read this excerpt also. Peter's father also had a problem with the marriage. He refused to meet Beverly until the day of the wedding. He said, "Well, I was on my boat fishing and I had 2 choices." This is something a Jewish mother could have written. "I could have thrown myself overboard or gone right on fishing. And being the intelligent man that I am, I went right on fishing." They did actually become best friends. And Beverly says she could never have survived the many things that happened to her without the support of her father-in-law. So at least that turned into a good relationship. Her mother actually ended up being impressed with her husband. He sort of won her over. He was a successful newspaper owner at the Cleveland Plain Dealer. He was well educated, self-assured, sophisticated, a decorated military man, and an experienced airline pilot. And on top of it, he was very handsome, which didn't hurt. So he tried very hard to win her over, and they accepted one another to the extent that they shared one mutual common interest, which was Beverly, of course. They made a deal to celebrate one holiday each. Christmas would be celebrated and Passover would be observed. And for about 5 years, Beverly lived at Peter's home in Shaker Heights, which was quite a long way from socioeconomically from her humble beginnings in Stuyvesant Town in New York. It was like little orphan Annie going to the home of Daddy Warbucks. The Cleveland social set was quite anti-Semitic and cold, and she found it unfriendly and inhospitable. So she did not really enjoy the palatial estate in Shaker Heights. If anything, she wanted a nice little condo that she could call the super in New York in case there would be a problem. I'll read to you this excerpt. Just remarks dropped in my home. A man who worked for my husband on the paper in a quite high position said to me after drinking a nice bit of very good wine, which I regret having served to him, "You know, if Peter's mother were alive, she'd die all over again if she knew she had married a Jew." And I said, "Don't worry, my family went into mourning too," which is almost kind of humorous. But when it came to her stage persona, her ethnicity was meaningless. In the operatic world, she says, in the final analysis, in the first act of Traviata, when the chorus leaves you all alone, it really doesn't matter what you are. You're on your own, and it's the loneliest moment of your life. Jew, Gentile, white, black, purple, orange, it doesn't matter. Fortunately, I was in a profession where no one ever said, "We're not going to let her sing Violetta, she's a Jew." The word talent was the primary word. I was never referred to as a talented Jew. I was referred to as a talented soprano. So in the entertainment world, her Judaism really did not come into play and was certainly not anything that held her back. It was not an impediment. There were family issues, as I mentioned. As I talked about, her mother's disappointment in her choice of marriage partner, her husband's extreme and difficult personality. Peter was a brash, confident, almost pompous, arrogant individual who turned a lot of people off. And Beverly said, "You know, my friends decided to stay with me in spite of Peter's personality." So he was difficult, not in the sense of being unreasonable, but I guess he had a little bit of a superiority complex, which was off-putting. But the biggest issue were the problems with the children. Their disabilities were, as Beverly says, a horror. Her children's health issues made any question of a Jewish upbringing moot. Her daughter, Molly Meredith, went to the Boston School for the Deaf, run by the Sisters of St. Joseph. Now, they run the finest school for deaf children in the world. And her daughter was a Catholic for the first 8 years of her life, and she did all the prayer rites and rituals. Sills says she was persuaded that Muffy should participate in the full menu of Catholic rites. The sister called me in and said, "Do you want her to be the only kid sitting out in the hall? What is going to hurt her? This will teach her that religion exists, that God exists." I said, "It will teach her that Jesus exists." I'm not sure this is what I want. But then I talked to my mother about it, and she said, "Look, let's get the child educated first, and then we can always introduce her to other choices." So we all agreed. So that was how she rationalized putting her daughter in the Catholic school. But this is pretty funny. The reality of a Christian daughter was jarring in the beginning. On the first Christmas that I gave, with grandparents and all, we hung up the stockings. We did the whole thing for all the kids. And when I went to pick Muffy up from school, Sister Dionysus, 6 foot tall, said, "Be sure you ask Mama who's coming to see you on Christmas Eve." I thought, good, they taught her about Santa Claus. So after the celebration, we were all just about ready to put the kids down to bed. There's champagne, and my father-in-law's there, the Bostonian, and I thought, oh, this is the perfect time. I said, "Muffy," and we had to lip read, "tell Grandma and Grandpa who's coming to see you tonight on Christmas Eve." Sills is already laughing so hard she can barely tell the story. And Muffy gets down on her knees, crosses herself, and she says, "Mother, Mary, Joseph, and baby God." Well, my father-in-law's champagne went halfway across the room. My mother sat there, and suddenly these two gloppy tears came down her face. And there's this little fat child with these little blonde ringlets. I mean, Muffy couldn't have been more waspy. With these big blue eyes, with her hands put together, so pleased with herself that she's speaking. She expected a totally different reaction, applause or something. But there's Grandma crying, Grandpa spitting the champagne across the room, Mama too stunned to speak, and Peter laughing so hard she was bewildered. You could almost make that into a Hollywood movie. You can imagine that scene. That's pretty funny. So that was how it was. And at the very end, she adds another fascinating dimension to the association category. And we'll go over the categories in a minute. But what did we talk about Jewish association is? Is it important for you to marry Jewish? Is it important for you to raise Jewish children? Is it important for you to be involved in the Jewish community? Is it important for you to have Jewish friends? Well, Beverly Sills introduces a new element to this category of association, and it's called death. I will tell you this, Peter and I and our children are going to be buried in a Jewish cemetery in Martha's Vineyard next to my mother and father. I offered Peter the choice. I said, we can go someplace that is non-sectarian, and I don't want you to feel obligated to be buried in the Jewish cemetery. He said, I don't feel obligated. I loved your mother, and she and I can continue our discussions. So he's going to be buried in a Jewish cemetery. And the author, Abigail Pogrebin, I asked why this mattered so much. Beverly answers, it was important to me as his wife that he be with me. And I'm not quite sure that had it been the other way around, if he'd asked me to be buried in his family plot, that I would have agreed. I'm just not sure I could have done that. And I think he understood that. I don't think I could have gone into a non-Jewish cemetery. I can't explain it. So you talk about, the people you want to hang out with. She wants to hang out with her own kind in the cemetery after she's gone. And I'm sure that's something we can all relate to. Can you imagine yourself buried in a non-Jewish cemetery? This is under the category of association. I think it's part of it. I didn't realize it before, but it really is. So let's have the JIS for Beverly Sills placed up, please, so we can take a look at it. We see that the quote I used is, like it or not, who I am is because of my Jewish parents and grandparents. All right, we go back to her memories of Seders and things like that. And that's why I gave her traditions and heritage 30%. There is an innate culture that has come to me because of them. So she feels a cultural ethnic connection to our people. And so I listed that at 35%. And then the association part, I was so taken by this strong sense of wanting to be buried in a Jewish cemetery that I included that at the same figure as culture and ethnicity. And my interpretation of her comment, though not a practicing Jew, Beverly retained a strong sense of Jewish identity at her core. All right. Any comments or questions?
Maybe I think we probably should move on to the next personality, and then if we have time at the end, we'll have some comments or questions.
Okay.
Okay, I was going to ask, it's Bobby. I was going to ask a question, but okay.
Go ahead, Bobby.
Oh, I was going to say, did she mention anything else about her other two children in her write-up?
No.
I mean, she talked about her daughter. Oh, okay.
No, and she talked about Peter Jr. being very, very autistic and being in a home and really just being unable to speak or communicate. So religion was a moot question for him. That's all.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Edward Irving Koch, born in Newark, New Jersey, attended Hebrew Free School, American politician, lawyer, political commentator, film critic, TV personality, served in the United States Congress from 1969 to 1977, and as we all know, was the irrepressible mayor of New York City for 3 terms from 1978 to 1989. He is, as we all know, a feisty, brash, shrewd, colorful individual, and he kind of typified New York toughness and bravado. A staunch advocate for the state of Israel. He did not let anyone get away with anything that was anti-Zionistic in any fashion. He almost kind of reminded me of Mort Klein of the Zionist Organization of America in his vociferous defense of the state of Israel, or almost like Alan Dershowitz. In the chapter, he's just in your face right out of the gate. So you know, he's very adamant about defending the state of Israel. And if anybody, even Peter Jennings, he went after because he did a 1996 documentary on Israel in which he felt that he had portrayed Jews rather negatively, but made the Arab side look like they were sophisticated, intelligent, and made cogent arguments. So he castigated Peter Jennings and also Susan Sontag from NPR, and just anybody he felt that didn't give Israel a fair shake, he was in their face. His father, Louis, was a furrier, and his mother, Joyce, was as he says, a terrible cook. She burned everything. Her father loved burnt food, but that is why Ed liked everything blood rare for the rest of his life. His mother was determined to assimilate. She hired a tutor to teach her to lose her Yiddish accent. So that was something. So she really didn't push religion much because she really wanted to assimilate. But Ed became a staunch defender of the Jewish people, and he was willing to fight for his right to be a Jew. And I'll give you an example of his fighting ways. In his last year of college, he was drafted into the Army, where he had a fight because he was a Jew. It all started because his platoon, according to Koch, was composed of 25% Jewish New Yorkers. It was an unusual number, and many of them simply couldn't do the obstacle course. I must say I found it hard, but I practiced. I wanted to look good. What the Jewish kids did excel in was asking questions. So when they had seminars, the Jewish kids would put up their hands and ask questions. And one day, this one guy said, "Which is the next Yid that's going to ask a question?" I knew I couldn't take on a fight because I wasn't strong enough yet. This happened in the first few weeks of basic training. So I said, I'm going to build myself up, and ultimately I'm going to challenge him. Koch trained hard over the next 16 weeks. It didn't help. He still beat me up. But I was proud of the mere fact that I challenged him. I went over to him and grabbed him by the throat, and I said, "We're going to have it out." And he said, "Why? What did I do?" And I couldn't say to him, "It's because of what you said." He looked baffled, but all I could say to him was, "You know, you know." So he wasn't afraid to fight anybody who criticized the Jewish people. He was proud of his faith, and he never shied away from his Jewishness while in office. Even so, surprisingly, he got a higher percentage of Catholic votes than Jewish votes. 81% of Italian and Irish descent voted for him, whereas only 73% Jewish. Why? Well, he wasn't liberal enough for the average West Side Jew. He was a moderate, and so that didn't work for the liberal community. He attends high holiday services every year, though he never had a Seder at Gracie Mansion, the mayor's residence. But he did put a mezuzah on the door. He was asked a fascinating question by the author: is he more Jewish or American? And he pulls out an anecdote to illustrate. When I was a congressman, early on, I noted that they had prayer breakfasts in Washington every 2 weeks, where a group of legislators would meet for breakfast and discuss religious matters. One day, a congressman from Mississippi, Sonny Montgomery, meets me on the House floor and says, "Ed, next week we want to discuss Judaism." "You're a Jew?" "Yes, I'm a Jew." "Would you come and lecture on Judaism?" I said, "Sure." At the time, I thought, I'm not a scholar. How much do I know? I'll go to the library and figure out what will amuse them. I took out a couple books, read them, and went to the breakfast. And I told them about Jewish exotica, which they enjoyed, and then they asked questions. At the end, I said, "What's interesting to me is you are all avoiding a question which I know is on your minds by looking in your eyes. And the question you're not asking me is, do Jews have dual loyalty? Isn't that what you're wondering?" They all nodded. "So I want to make one pledge to you," and I raised my right hand. I swear to you that if Israel ever invades the United States, I shall stand with the United States. And they roared. So he was clearly American, but also Jewish, and has a deep fealty, as I said, to Israel, especially when she is under siege or being targeted. One prescient comment that he made, because as I said, he passed away in 2013. He said, anti-Semitism has rearisen to an extent even greater than before World War II. Without the Holocaust, the hate and the venom, it's directed at Israel, but is intended for all Jews. Wow, that's exactly what's going on today. So he recognized even then that anti-Semitism was under the guise of anti-Zionism. And he says, don't think that anti-Zionism is separate from anti-Semitism. The two are inextricably linked. And that is so true today. The quote I picked for Ed is, if I had to pick the two things that I'm most proud of, it's being an American and being a Jew. To which I elaborated, despite primary allegiance to America, Koch is a staunch defender of Israel, which I've already said 3 times. So let's put up the JIS for Ed Koch. Do we see that yet? Okay, here it's coming. I gave him 10% for religion God because he goes to the holidays every year. Oh, we got back to Beverly Sills. Technical difficulty? Robin, do we have the JIS up for Ed?
Yeah, hang on, my screen sharing closed for some reason.
Okay, take your time.
Rabbi, while Robin's fixing the screen, I'm going to mention that I looked it up and Beverly Sills was not buried on Martha's Vineyard. She was buried at a cemetery in Westchester County, New York. But that cemetery did have a Jewish section.
Good, that's all that matters. Okay, thank you. All right, I gave him 10% religion God because he goes to the holidays every year. Obviously, his connection to Israel and Zionism, that's a full 50%. He's aware of the rise of anti-Semitism, so I gave him 30% for that. And the history and survival of the Jewish people because of the tenacity of Israel and the Jewish people to continue. I'm trying to think of the exact part of the chapter that led me to that, to give him the 10% for history. I don't quite remember what it was, but we'll give him the 10%. All right, let's move on. There's a lot to cover with Mike Nichols. And as I said, I related quite a bit to a lot of what was said in this chapter. So Mike Nichols, as you know, is most famous for having directed The Graduate. And there was quite a lengthy explanation of that in our chapter with Dustin Hoffman. And the beginning of the chapter for him also goes into that, which I'm going to skip. But he was born in Berlin in 1931. And he escaped Berlin when he was 7 years old. And this immediately just tugged at my heartstrings because my mother left Berlin also when she was 14 years old. And they left in the same year in 1939. My mother went on the Kinder transport to England, and Mike went to America with his 4-year-old brother with a chaperone to take them there. But that immediately I sensed the connection. Mike was 83 when he passed away in 2014 in New York City. He was an American film and theater director, a comedian, actor, a screenwriter, was married to Diane Sawyer. And his name originally in Germany was Michael Igor Peczkowski. He attended a Jewish segregated school, as he describes it. Now, when you think of the word segregated, we think of African Americans. We don't think of Jews being segregated. And yet in Germany, that's exactly what Jews were. They had to go to separate schools, and they were never really told why. So to think of that word segregation being applied to Jews is a little bit jolting. But his family had an escape hatch. His father was Russian, and they had Russian passports. And the most important part is this was during the Stalin-Hitler Pact. It was a non-aggression pact in 1939 where Russia and Germany agreed to stay out of each other's way in the invasion and subsequent divvying up of Poland. So because of that, they were right at the perfect time. They were able to get out of Germany. And I'd like to read you the first excerpt. Very few people seem to know what you needed financially to get into this country. Every individual had to have someone guarantee them financially for the rest of their lives. We were a family of 4. Each one of us had to have a specific financial guarantee for our lifetimes. And luckily, to put it mildly, my mother had a cousin with money who was already in the United States, and he did it. But without that, you couldn't get a visa. It's not exactly your huddled masses, but nobody knows this. And this reminded me of my father, who left Germany in 1935 and came to America. He took up residence in Salt Lake City. His parents and younger siblings moved to Bolivia, South America, to escape Hitler. And my father was the one who provided the affidavit for the rest of my family to come to America. And by the way, my mother's parents went to Shanghai, China, and they were part of the Jewish ghetto in Shanghai. And they were only reunited much later after the war in Los Angeles. So much of what he's talking about, I was personally connected to. It also got me thinking about who's a Holocaust survivor. For years, a Holocaust survivor was defined as someone who survived the camps. And only in recent decades has that definition been expanded to include anyone whose life was disrupted by the Holocaust. And that includes my parents, my grandparents, all of them had their lives disrupted. My mother didn't graduate from high school. She was very educated, but she never was able to graduate. So all of my parents and grandparents were Holocaust survivors. So that's something we don't always think about, but it's quite true. All right, Mike's father was a physician, and he changed the family name from Peczkowski to Nichols after his paternal grandfather, Nikolaevich Peczkowski, a name which he said by the time his patients uttered it, they were already cured. So he changed it to Nichols, and that's how Mike adopted his name. His father sadly died of leukemia when Mike was only 12, and his mother, who had stayed in Germany because she was ill, joined her boys in America a few years before her husband died to support them. Mike came from a family where no rituals were observed. The family knew garnished about Judaism, but, and this is what's fascinating, they were still as Jewish as gefilte fish. This is the quote I took for Mike. Nobody in my family knew anything about it, i.e. Jewish rituals, and yet you could hardly say they weren't Jewish. Beautiful. You don't have to know anything about Judaism. You don't ever have to have attended Sunday school or synagogue or done anything Jewish in your life, yet somehow you feel Jewish. How is that possible? I think we're the only religious, cultural, ethnic group where you could say something like that without any background, you still feel in your kishkas that you're part of our people and part of our heritage. I find that fascinating. His maternal grandparents were well-known German writers whose Judaism was not based in the synagogue at all. Mike's grandmother, Hedwig Lachmann, was a well-known poet who wrote the libretto for Salome with Richard Strauss. Salome was the first opera I ever saw. Boy, was that dark. But anyway, it's amazing that she wrote the libretto for that, which she translated from Oscar Wilde's French. Her grandfather, Gustav Landauer, wrote many books, and in collaboration with Martin Buber, who I wrote my rabbinical thesis on, was one of the first people to work towards creating a Palestine. So he had pretty famous grandparents. And it reminded me, I have a connection to somebody famous in Germany too. On my father's side, a distant cousin, her name is Elsa Lasker Schuler. and she was a famous poet in Germany. And I'll never forget this, but in the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., they have TV monitors all over the place. And I walked under a TV monitor that showed famous German scientists, intellectuals, scholars, journalists, scientists who had been either killed or displaced from Germany. And as I'm walking underneath this monitor, there's a picture of Elsa Lasker Schuler. I couldn't believe it. Then when my wife and I were in Berlin for a rabbinical tour for the 75th anniversary of Kristallnacht in 2013, we attended the Geiger Reform Rabbinical School in West Berlin, and the students led a service there, and this little diminutive young lady who gave the Devar Torah read a poem from Elsa Lasker Schuler. So again, as he's talking about his grandparents who were well-known German intelligentsia, I immediately connected to the person in my family as well. That's what I'm telling you. What are the connections? Maybe some of you have some connections to what we're talking about too, if you have relatives from Germany. But anyway, so Mike's grandparents were called ideological Jews because they didn't practice Judaism in any form. But what is an ideological Jew? What would that mean to you? How would you define that? When we think of ideologies, we think of the isms, fascism, communism, but Judaism? Is Judaism an ideology? An ideology means you accept our way of thinking or you're out of the fold. And we're not like that. So what does it mean to say you're an ideological Jew? I think it means that you buy into the whole corpus of the flow of Jewish history, which is that we believe in a linear progression of history. There's creation, then there's revelation. God gives the Torah to the Jewish people in order to perfect the world, to bring it to redemption through messianic, the coming of the Messiah, or if you're a liberal Jew, the Messianic age. That's how we believe the progression of history should attain. And to me, if that's all you believe, that's fine. And if you don't practice one stitch of Judaism, but you believe that, you're an ideological Jew. All right. Just as there were no Jewish rituals, there was no pressure to marry Jewish. And Mike had 4 marriages, all to non-Jewish women. His mother was very guilt-provoking, but not about getting married. It led to a well-known comedy sketch called Mother and Son that was done by Nichols and Mays. Do you remember that famous comedic duo in the 1950s and early 60s? Mike Nichols and Elaine May. So I want to read you an excerpt about this mother and son sketch. The Jewish mother that Elaine played was so horrifyingly recognizable, so familiar, and so hilariously guilt-provoking. He offers an example. She, Elaine, playing the mother, was complaining that I never called. She said she hadn't eaten because she didn't want to take the chance that her mouth might be full when her son finally called. I would say I was busy sending up the Vanguard, Mother, which was a rocket at the time. I didn't have a second. She said, well, it's always something, isn't it? And then finally she said, I hope I haven't made you feel bad. I said, are you kidding? I feel awful. She said, oh, honey, if I could believe that, I'd be the happiest mother in the world. She said, someday, Arthur, someday you'll have children of your own. And when you do, I only pray that they make you suffer the way you've made me suffer. That's all I pray. That's a mother's prayer. So they turned this into a comedy sketch that was part of their act. And it was a big hit. I checked out some of their records. I guess they were in the era of Alan Sherman, but they did like about 5 comedy albums that have sketches on them, and I'd like to pick those up and take a listen. I'm sure they're very, very entertaining. All right, he gets association points for his college friends who made him feel more Jewish. They sat around telling immigrant jokes, the fact that they were all Jewish, and the fact that they were so lucky to be alive and attending the University of Chicago. So he gets that too. He also riffs a little bit on Jewish comedy. And the author writes, I wonder if Nichols thinks any generalizations can be made about why so many comedians and comedy writers are Jewish. Jewish introspection and Jewish humor is a way of surviving, he says, not only as a group, but as individuals. If you're not handsome and you're not athletic and you're not rich, There is still one last hope with girls, which is being funny. Girls like funny guys. And he also writes, humor is a way of helping you survive if something awful happens. And all these things Jews are practiced in, all these things Jews have had to pull out of their hats when things got tough. And that's so true. I just saw such an interesting show on Amazon Prime, which I highly recommend. It's called When Jews Were Funny. So if you remember comedians like Shecky Green and, oh gosh, who else was there? David Brenner and all these great comedians from the 60s, take a look at that show. It's hilarious. And it gives you such a great insight into why the great majority of comedians in the 20th century were Jewish. It's called When Jews Were Funny on Amazon Prime. He talks about my big fat Greek wedding and was asked, could that have been a Jewish family? And he says, no, not really. Greeks have a kind of overwhelming sense of vitality and an utterly sustaining love of family. They are full of life and love and fun. Jews are full of angst, pain, guilt, and are, as we say in German, I mean, like Eskimos have 20 words for snow. Jews have 20 words for anger. There's Ogelblusen, there's böse, there's I'm beleidigt or erledigt, about something all the time. You know, there's anger, there's resentment, there's, oh my goodness, you get a Jewish family around and, you know, is it all like the Greeks? I don't know. Greeks are joy and family. I think Jews are oi and family. There's a mother who's easily hurt. There's a father who's difficult or has low self-esteem or has unrealistic expectations of children. So what kind of identity results from Jewish guilt, but no Jewish customs? And what we get is his answer. Certainly heritage. Religion, I'd have to say no. In an intellectual way, I'm glad that the Jewish religion doesn't contain things that I find really difficult, like eating God. That's not one of the things that I would want to do with God. I've tried and tried to understand it, but I can't. And when Catholic friends explained to me that transubstantiation is literal, that it is not a metaphor, I gave up. I said, well, I respect it, but I will never understand it. So for Mike Nichols, his comment is, nobody in my family knew anything about it, Jewish rituals or holidays, and yet you could hardly say they weren't Jewish. And my comment, my summary of that is, despite self-imposed alienation from the Jewish religion and the Jewish community, Mike feels a strong sense, or felt, I'm sorry, he passed away, a strong sense of Jewish identity. He gets big points for culture, ethnicity, big points for history and survival, because he believes he is so lucky that he survived Nazi Germany to come to America and to have such a blessed life. So he understands the true essence of the miracle of Jewish survival. And because of his experiences in Germany, we gave him anti-Semitism, a sense of otherness, and the association points because of the connection he made with his college friends. And there you have it. What I'd like to do in future weeks, I'd like to take volunteers for next week. We're going to be looking at three different personalities. Who do we have next week, Robin?
We have Natalie Portman, Alan Dershowitz, and Stephen Breyer.
Okay, I would like three volunteers.
They're not up on the share screen because my share screen shows it.
Okay, I would like to have three volunteers who, if you'd like to care to do a little research to tell us what have Natalie Portman, Alan Dershowitz, and Stephen Breyer been doing since the publication of this book in 2005. Can I have three volunteers?
Well, Susan and I will always volunteer.
I'd like volunteers from our participants today. All you have to do is go on the internet, Google the name, and it'll tell you what they've been up to. And this is just a way of getting some of our participants to get involved. So can we just have a few volunteers?
Bobby, did I see your hand get raised? No, I guess not.
No, you did not.
All right, I will take care of it and pass it around.
Going once, going twice. All right, going 3 times. All right, that's okay. Don't worry about it. So
I
next,
do have a question. I do have a question though.
sure.
You never really went into any talk about his marriage to Diane Sawyer.
There was nothing in there.
Oh, okay. That answers that. Thank you.
It just said that he's married to Diane Sawyer, and that was it.
Okay.
Yep.
I think she just mentioned that she was upstairs working. And
Right. Yes, that's
come
it.
down.
He was
Sometimes the
working
spouse comes out.
upstairs. Yep. Okay. We will see you. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next week, next Wednesday, and every Wednesday in August from 1 to 2. Have a wonderful week.